Hi all. So this is a short video for this week for you all. If you were looking for one, there was no video for Tuesday, so you didn't miss out on anything. So today we're talking about conceptualization and operationalization. Really, the question, and this is the question that if you look on the syllabus is posed, is how do we go about measuring our concepts? So a concept, right, is essentially a more precise notion of, the sort of fuzzy, imprecise things that we think. So like, if we're talking about something like, we have a fuzzy idea of something like gender in our head, right? A conceptualization of it is essentially a more precise version. It's a more precise definition, right? So it's at a theoretical level. So like when you go through any sort of standard textbook, the definitions that you have in there for anything, right, is usually the concept of it, right? It's the conceptualization. So that's one process that's important for how we understand the things we want to test, is we have to understand what is our definition, how are we defining it, how are we understanding it, right? And that happens at the level of conceptualization. Operationalization is a little bit different. Operationalization is how do you measure it, right? And we've talked about these two concepts before. They're going to be important coming up. Next week you have your research question, and really what we're going to do for our research question is we're going to think about how are we going to measure, right, the variables, the different concepts we're interested in the topics we picked. So regardless of what topic you picked, if you picked, something like understanding, the impact of race on perceptions of police violence, right? You're going to have to give me how are you going to measure the term race, and you're going to have to give me how are you measuring. How are you defining the term race? How are you defining the term police violence? How are you measuring the term race? How are you measuring the term police violence, right? So you're going to give me your conceptualization and your operationalizations of each. Okay, so a couple things that we should probably talk about in terms of measurement is the difference between direct observables, indirect observables, and constructs. So a direct observable are things you can observe on the surface. So if you think about it, these are things that you can see, hear, smell, taste, right? These are, things like hair color, or like, like to some degree like height, right? They're things that you can observe directly on the object that you're studying. In this case, human beings usually. An indirect observable, if you want to think of it, are things you can be told about. You can observe them, but you can only observe them indirectly. So a lot of the things we gather through surveys are indirect observables. So this could be something like you can't tell just by looking, not with any certainty, right, what people's political affiliations are, right? But that's a question you could ask them and they could tell you. That would be an indirect observable. The last thing is that we have constructs. This essentially takes more work than an indirect observable. Constructs are only observable through multiple questions, right? So if you want to think about in terms of something like, if you're thinking in criminology, the idea of like onomy, right? This sense of normlessness, this sense of not belonging, right? That essentially pervades society, right? You can't just ask people in a survey, do you feel anomic, right? It's not an indirect observable. It's too abstract of a concept, right? Or in sociology, you think about terms like alienation, right? That you feel alienated from your labor, right? Thousands of pages have been spent on defining that concept, right? But in terms of turning it into a form of measurement, you can't just ask people, are you alienated? You have to ask them questions that when taken together, right, become indirect sort of indicators of your of the concept you're interested in. So those are the three different ways of thinking about measurement. Okay. The next thing we should make sure you understand is that in the chapter on scales, what are scales, what are indexes? So indexes are essentially when you compile a bunch of questions. So this would be often what you'd use for what we were just calling constructs, right? Is when you take multiple questions and you turn them into one measure, one piece of data, one data point. So essentially you do that simply by adding scores together. Now, scales are a type of index. So they're a type of index where there's a logical structure underlying it, right? Where indexes may just be, the questions might not have any specific structure to them. You're not trying to weight things in any specific manner, right? Scales are, in essence, just a way of adding a set structure to it to make it more precise, to make it better. Often you're going to use indexes in things like already existing data. So if you're running statistics on existing data sets produced by the government, right, you're not going to be able to create a scale. You might be able to mock one up, but you're not going to be able to create a scale because the questions weren't worded that way. They weren't created that way. And so you'll generally create an index. If you're going to create an index on a survey, and for those of you who, for your research design, are going to do something quantitative, right, I'll expect you guys to write up a survey. And if you want an index variable, right, you could do a scale just as easily as an index, so you might as well. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys turn to page 177 in your book. So if you don't have your book out, pause the video and go ahead and pick it up. So on page 177, we have several versions of scale construction. How are scales constructed? The two that you're actually likely to use are the Likert scaling and the semantic differential. So if you look at the Likert scaling, to some degree we've all actually done this before, right? We've all kind of taken surveys where we've seen this. It's sort of like somebody makes a statement, right? So rather than a question, you get a statement, and it's like, if you're measuring something like racism with a scale, right? You have a question like, I don't know, to what degree do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It's better for African Americans to live in African American neighborhoods than white people to live in white neighborhoods, right? Like, strongly agree, strongly disagree, and you're trying to pick up on whether the person answering that question is racist. Essentially what you're going to have is you're going to have a series of what are called Likert items, right? Likert items is that way of structuring a question that, when taken together, compile into a numeric score. Each of the questions are equally weighted, right? So like if you have 20 questions, at the end you're going to have a 1 to 20 measure of how racist people are from whether they answer those questions. So that's essentially what a Likert scale does, is how a Likert scale works. Now a lot of times you'll see Likert items on surveys. I actually think maybe your student evaluations are even structured into Likert items, but they don't compile a score, so it's not actually a Likert scale, it's just that structure of questions. This is a very good way to structure questions if you're writing a survey. There's a couple things you should watch out for. One is that if you have too many of those questions, you'll create something called a response set. And by a response set, I mean that people will stop really thinking about how they're answering questions, and they'll just either select down the middle someplace, or they'll just select one answer for positive and one answer for negative without actually getting any of the gradation that you're looking for. One way to help with a response set is also not to give an even number of categories. So rather than doing 1 to 5, doing 1 to 6. So that's a general idea behind a Likert. That's how Likert scaling works. Okay. The other one is semantic differentials, which is similar to Likert, but somewhat different. And here, rather than having sort of a statement that you agree or disagree with, they provide you with extremes, right? And if you look on this page 181, it works really well. In this case, the author is having them listen to a piece of music, and they have to rank it from very much, somewhat, never, somewhat, very much, between enjoyable, one extreme, right, and unenjoyable, the other extreme. So the difference between semantic differentials is it's people placing their reactions within extremes. One advantage of this is it actually gets people to think about their reactions to things in emotional ways, which is actually a deeper form of processing, which can sometimes actually probably yield more likely results. Another great thing about semantic differentials is that you can capture really fuzzy things with it, right? And that's what you're seeing them using it for, right? Listening to a piece of music is kind of a fuzzy experience. So the semantic differential gives it a framework, right? And then just like the Likert items, at the end of the semantic differentials, you can just simply add up the scores and get a general score. So you could score like basically whether people liked, right, this piece of music or whatever, right, by doing that. Okay. So those are the major things that you really need to take out of these two chapters. I'll probably leave it there for you guys. And if you have any questions, or if there's things I didn't talk about in the video that are in the chapters that you wanted to know more about, I'm more than happy to interact with you a little bit more on it. Just let me know. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll have 2 videos like normal next week. So, and last thing, a couple of reminders. Remember, your lit reviews due 10 to 15 sources. You don't have to write out a paragraph or a description or anything. I'm just looking for you to go out and find them. You can spend more time reading them over the semester. Next week we're going to talk more about your research question and what your research question is going to involve. And then we'll move forward in that. Have a great week and talk to you all soon. Bye.